What if the very scars on your back were the only thing keeping your entire kingdom alive? She endured the whip every single dawn, bleeding to protect a horrifying pack secret. But when the ruthless Northern Alpha King caught her scent, every lie her abusers told instantly went up in flames. If you look into the historical archives of the 14th century, you will find vague, terrified references to a disease that ravaged the European countryside. Human historians called it the sweating sickness or the pale death. But in the hidden, shadow-veiled world of the werewolf packs, it was known by its true, devastating name, the silver blight. It was a genetic corruption that caused a wolf's cellular structure to reject its own healing factor, essentially turning their own blood against them. By the winter of 1342, packs were going extinct. But one territory remained miraculously untouched, thriving in sickening opulence, while the rest of the world burned. This was the Oakhaven pack, ruled by the cruel and fiercely ambitious Alpha Thaddius Redfern. Thaddius claimed that his pack healers had discovered a botanical miracle, an elixir brewed from rare herbs deep in the Oakhaven forests that could stall and sometimes cure the silver blight. He sold tiny crystal vials of this Oakhaven elixir to desperate alphas across the continent in exchange for land gold and absolute political submission. But there were no rare herbs. There was no botanical miracle. There was only Genevieve. Deep beneath the lavish stone halls of the Oakhaven Manor, in a lightless, freezing subterranean cell, 20-year-old Genevieve Hayes lay curled on a bed of rotting straw. She was not a rogue nor a criminal. She was an Omega by rank, but her bloodline held a secret so ancient and powerful that Thaddius was willing to commit daily atrocities to monopolize it. Genevieve was the last living descendant of the white lycans, a primordial breed of healers whose blood carried natural antibodies to almost any lupine disease, including the silver blight. Every morning, exactly at dawn, the heavy iron door of her cell would groan open. Upmut. The grating voice of Graham Thaddius's massive scarred lead enforcer would echo off the damp walls. Genevieve didn't fight back. She couldn't. Her daily meals consisted of a watery gruel, heavily laced with liquid wolfsbane. The poison suppressed her wolf, keeping her in a state of perpetual, agonizing weakness. She was entirely trapped in her human form, stripped of the supernatural strength and healing that should have been her birthright. Graham dragged her by her matted dark hair to the center of the room, chaining her wrists to an iron ring bolted to the ceiling. Then Alpha Thaddius would enter, dressed in fine velvets and smelling of roasted meats and expensive wine. He held a silver-tipped flail in his hand. They didn't just bleed her with a knife. Thaddius had discovered early on that a white lycan's blood only released its highest concentration of healing enzymes when the wolf was subjected to immense, life-threatening stress and adrenaline. So the extraction was disguised as punishment. For the prosperity of the pack, Genevieve Thaddius would sneer right before the first blow landed. The silver tips tore through her thin linen shift, biting deep into the flesh of her back. Genevieve bit her lip until it bled, refusing to scream. She had learned that screaming only made Thaddius drag it out longer. With every brutal lash, her unique blood shimmering with a faint, iridescent silver glow before settling into a deep crimson, splattered against the stone floor, and ran down her back. Graham stood close by with a wide silver basin, expertly catching the runoff from her wounds. She took 30 lashes every single day. By the end of it, she was barely conscious, hanging limply from the chains, her breathing shallow and ragged. Why did she stay? Why didn't she end her own life to stop the torment? Because Thaddius held a twisted leverage over her. The human villages surrounding Oakhaven were entirely defenseless. Thaddius had explicitly promised that If Genevieve ever died by her own hand or refused to produce the blood, he would massacre every single human man, woman, and child in the valley. Genevieve, burdened with the pure, protective heart of a white lycan, absorbed the agony of the whip to keep thousands of innocents alive. Once the basin was full, Graham unchained her, letting her broken body collapse onto the freezing stones. "Filter it, bottle it, and prepare it for the royal convoy," Thaddius ordered Graham, wiping a speck of Genevieve's blood from his pristine leather boots. "King Cedric arrives tonight. He brings 2 chests of solid gold for this batch. Ensure it is pristine." As the heavy door slammed shut, plunging her back into darkness, Genevieve lay in her own pooling blood. The wolfsbane in her system made her healing excruciatingly slow. The wounds from yesterday had barely closed before they were ripped open again today. She closed her eyes, praying to the moon goddess for an end to the pain, unaware that her salvation was currently marching through the northern mountain pass, bringing a storm of violence with him. The ground of Oakhaven trembled under the thunderous hooves of 200 heavily armored warhorses. Alpha King Cedric Montgomery of the Northern Howl was a living legend. Known in whispered, terrified gossip as the Winter Butcher, Cedric had conquered the savage northern territories through sheer unparalleled brutality. He was a colossal man, standing well over 6.5 feet tall, with piercing ice-blue eyes and a demeanor as unforgiving as a blizzard. But the terrifying king was hiding a desperate vulnerability. His younger sister, Princess Rosalind, was dying. The silver blight had reached her heart. Cedric had drained his kingdom's coffers, buying Thaddius's Oakhaven elixir, which was the only thing keeping Rosalind breathing. He had come personally to Oakhaven, not just to purchase more, but to demand the recipe, willing to offer military protection or annihilate the entire pack if Thaddius refused. When Cedric strode into the great hall of Oakhaven, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thaddius, flanked by his vain, jewel-draped daughter Beatrix, bowed so low his nose nearly touched the floorboards. "Your Majesty," Thaddius groveled, sweating profusely, "we are deeply honored. A grand feast has been prepared, and the elixir you requested is securely bottled." Cedric didn't smile. He didn't even look at Beatrix, who was heavily perfumed, and batting her eyelashes, desperately hoping to be chosen as the king's mate. "I have no time for your pleasantries, Redfern." Cedric's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. "Show me the apothecary. Show me how the cure is made." Panic flashed in Thaddius's eyes, quickly masked by a slick smile. "Of course, Your Grace. But first you and your men must eat. You have ridden for weeks. My hospitality would be shamed if I did not offer you our finest roasted boar and ale." Reluctantly, Cedric took his seat at the head of the long oak table. His heavily armed commander, Sir William, stood rigidly behind him. As the feast commenced, the hall filled with the sounds of raucous laughter, clinking goblets and tearing meat. Down in the scullery, miles away from the opulence, Genevieve was forced to her feet. The head cook, a cruel woman, loyal to Thaddius, shoved a massive iron-banded pitcher of spiced wine into Jen's trembling hands. "Take this to the high table," the cook snapped. "Please," Genevieve whispered, her voice hoarse, her back screaming in agony with every slight movement. The linen of her dress was soaked through with fresh, dark blood from that morning's extraction. "I am not fit to be seen. Alpha Thaddius ordered me to stay hidden. Lady Beatrix specifically asked for you to serve the king's table." The cook sneered, slapping Genevieve hard across the face. "She wants the Northern King to see what kind of filthy, broken omegas we use for labor here. It highlights her own beauty. Now walk before I call Graham." Trembling, Genevieve lifted the heavy pitcher. Every step up the stone stairs was a battle against unconsciousness. Her vision swam. The scent of roasted meat made her starved stomach cramp violently. In the great hall, Cedric was pushing his food around his plate, entirely unappetized. His inner wolf, a massive ancient beast, had been pacing restlessly in his mind ever since they crossed the Oakhaven borders. Something was wrong here. The entire manor smelled of rich perfumes, roasted garlic, and a faint metallic tang. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors to the kitchens creaked open. Genevieve stepped into the light of the torches. She was hunched over, her hair falling like a dark curtain over her bruised face. She wore literal rags, completely barefoot, limping toward the high table. At that exact moment, the wind shifted through the hall's open windows. Cedric's hand stopped mid-air. His ice-blue eyes widened. Martyr. The word exploded in his mind. His ancient wolf slammed against the cages of his consciousness, roaring so loudly in his head it nearly blinded him. But it wasn't just the intoxicating scent of rain pine and wild honey that belonged to his fated mate. Beneath that, Cedric smelled the harsh, toxic reek of wolfsbane. And beneath that, Cedric smelled the elixir. He had hand-fed the Oakhaven elixir to his dying sister for months. He knew the scent of that metallic, silver-tinged liquid better than his own sweat. He stared intently at the broken girl dragging herself across the floor. The scent of the life-saving cure wasn't coming from a plant. It was radiating from the fresh, bleeding wounds beneath her torn dress. She was the cure. Genevieve reached the high table. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the pitcher. Beatrix, sitting near Cedric, leaned over with a malicious smirk and deliberately stuck her foot out. Genevieve tripped. The heavy iron pitcher crashed onto the stone floor. Spiced red wine splashed everywhere, coating the hem of Beatrix's expensive silk gown. "You clumsy, worthless bitch!" Beatrix shrieked, leaping up. The hall went dead silent. Thaddius's face turned purple with rage. He saw Genevieve, the secret he had desperately tried to hide from the king, bleeding and exposed in the middle of the room. In a panic to maintain his authority and quickly remove her, Thaddius shot out of his chair. He unclipped the heavy leather riding crop from his belt and raised it high above his head, aiming directly for Genevieve's already shredded back. "I will flay the flesh from your bones for insulting our guests," Thaddius roared, bringing the whip down. Genevieve squeezed her eyes shut and threw her arms over her head, bracing for the inevitable agonizing strike. The blow never landed. A sound erupted in the hall, a feral, earth-shattering snarl that sounded less like a man and more like a primordial demon. Before the riding crop could touch a single hair on Genevieve's head, Cedric vaulted over the massive oak table, shattering the heavy wood into splinters. He moved with a speed that defied logic. In a blur of black armor and unbridled fury, Cedric caught the falling whip in his bare hand. Thaddius gasped, his eyes bulging as he tried to pull the crop back, but Cedric held it with a grip of solid iron. Slowly the Northern King turned his head to look at Thaddius. Cedric's human eyes were gone. In their place were the glowing, terrifyingly bright gold irises of a fully dominant Alpha King whose mate had just been threatened. "Touch her," Cedric whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal dark promise that made the stone walls of Oakhaven tremble, "and I will erase your entire bloodline from the earth." The great hall of Oakhaven plunged into a suffocating, terrified silence. The only sound was the jagged, ragged breathing of Alpha Thaddius, whose wrist was still locked in King Cedric's unbreakable grip. The Northern Alpha King stood over the cowering Oakhaven leader, like an ancient god of war awakened from a centuries-long slumber. With a sickening crack, Cedric twisted his hand. Thaddius unleashed a high-pitched, agonizing scream as the bones in his forearm splintered. He dropped to his knees, clutching his mangled arm. The heavy leather riding crop clattered uselessly against the stone floor. "Aye, guards!" Beatrix shrieked, her face pale with horror. "Treason! The Northern King is attacking my father! Kill him!" Instantly, the Oakhaven soldiers stationed along the walls drew their broadswords, stepping forward to defend their alpha. But they didn't even make it 3 paces. Hold. Sir William Cedric's massive commander didn't just speak the word. He roared it with the full, crushing weight of a Northern Beta's command. In perfect, terrifying synchronization, the 200 Northern Knights sitting at the banquet tables rose to their feet. The metallic hiss of 200 steel blades being drawn from their scabbards echoed through the cavernous hall. They formed an impenetrable, bristling wall of armor and weaponry around their king and the broken girl on the floor. Cedric ignored the impending bloodshed. He didn't care about the swords pointed at him. His glowing, ice-blue eyes, now entirely consumed by the golden ring of his alpha beast, were fixed solely on Genevieve. He dropped to his knees beside her. Up close, the toxic metallic scent of the Oakhaven elixir was overpowering. It was radiating directly from the fresh blood, soaking through the thin, ragged linen on her back. Mate Cedric whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound awe and devastating heartbreak. Genevieve flinched as he reached out, instinctively curling into a tighter ball. She was so heavily drugged with wolfsbane that her own wolf couldn't recognize him. To her, this colossal, heavily armored man was just another alpha, another monster who wanted to use her. "Please," Genevieve gasped, her voice barely a rasp. "Please don't hurt them. The villagers. He'll kill the humans in the valley if I don't give him the blood. I'll go back to the cell. I'll give you what you want." Cedric's heart stopped. The pieces of the grotesque puzzle slammed together in his mind with nauseating clarity. There were no rare herbs. There was no botanical miracle in the Oakhaven forests. The elixir that had been keeping his sister Rosalind alive, the liquid he had paid chests of solid gold for, was the tortured, extracted blood of his fated mate. Cedric gently reached out, ignoring her flinch, and laid his massive, calloused hand against her cheek. The moment his skin touched hers, a violently bright spark of pure electrical warmth shot through them both. It was the mate bond, ancient and undeniable, fighting through the toxic sludge of the wolfsbane in her veins. Genevieve gasped, her dark eyes widening as a sudden, unfamiliar surge of strength pulsed through her shattered body. "No one is going to the cell," Cedric vowed, his voice a low, rumbling promise that seemed to vibrate straight into her bones. "And no one will ever touch a single hair on your head again." He carefully shifted his grip, gently tearing the ruined linen of her dress down her shoulder to assess the damage. The entire great hall gasped. Sir William, a hardened veteran of countless bloody wars, actually took a step back in sheer horror. Genevieve's back was a canvas of atrocities. Layers upon layers of thick, silvery scar tissue crisscrossed her pale skin, mapping out years of systematic daily torture. Fresh, deep lacerations from that morning's extraction were still oozing that unmistakable, faintly glowing crimson blood. Cedric slowly stood up. The air temperature in the room plummeted. Frost literally began to form on the edges of the oak tables and the stone pillars. His alpha aura expanded, a crushing, suffocating wave of pure, unfiltered dominance that forced every Oakhaven soldier to their knees. "You told the continent that you were master herbalists." Cedric's voice was dangerously quiet, cutting through the frozen silence like a razor. He slowly turned his gaze to Thaddius, who was writhing on the floor, weeping from the pain of his shattered arm. "You sold salvation in a glass vial, but this is a white lycan." Murmurs of shock rippled through the Northern Knights. The white lycans were a myth, a bedtime story told to pups about a sacred bloodline of healers blessed by the moon goddess herself. "She is a freak." Thaddius spat his desperation, making him reckless. "Her father, Arthur Hayes, was a traitor. When the blight came, I took her in. I kept her alive. Her blood belongs to Oakhaven. Without me, your sister dies. Cedric, you need my extraction methods." She won't give it willingly. You think I would force my queen to bleed to save my kingdom? Cedric asked, stepping toward Thaddius. You think I am anything like you? Beatrix, realizing her royal ambitions were crumbling into dust, sneered. Your queen, that filthy, broken stray. She's an omega. She doesn't even have a wolf. She's defective. Before Cedric could move, Genevieve forced herself to stand. The sparks from Cedric's touch had ignited something deep within her, a primal instinct that had been buried under years of poison and pain. She swayed dangerously, leaning against the heavy wooden table for support, but she lifted her chin. I am not defective, Genevieve said, her voice echoing through the silent hall. You poisoned my food with liquid wolfsbane for 5 years. You threatened to slaughter innocent children to keep me in chains. She looked at Cedric, her eyes filled with a desperate, fierce clarity. In the western wing beneath the armory, there is a ledger. He has been planning to infect the western packs with the blight, using tainted blankets, just so he could sell them the cure at double the price. Thaddius's face drained of all color. Secure the western wing, Sir William barked at a dozen of his knights. Find that ledger. Kill them, Thaddius screamed, panic finally breaking his mind. Kill the Northern King. Kill the bitch. The command was the final nail in Oakhaven's coffin. Graham, the massive, scarred enforcer, who had whipped Genevieve every morning, roared and charged at Cedric, swinging a heavy iron mace aimed directly at the king's skull. Cedric didn't even draw his sword. He moved with blinding supernatural speed. As the mace came crashing down, Cedric stepped inside Graham's guard, entirely ignoring the weapon. He grabbed the enforcer by the throat, his massive hand wrapping entirely around Graham's neck. With a brutal upward thrust, Cedric lifted the 300-pound man off the floor, using only one arm. Graham choked, his eyes bulging as he dropped the mace. Cedric stared into the eyes of the man who had tortured his mate. For every drop of her blood you spilled, Cedric whispered, his eyes glowing like miniature suns, you will pay in kind. With a sickening crunch that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, Cedric crushed Graham's windpipe. He tossed the lifeless body aside like a discarded rag. The Oakhaven soldiers immediately dropped their weapons, throwing themselves face down onto the stone floor in absolute surrender. They had just watched the legendary Winter Butcher slaughter their strongest warrior with his bare hands. The fight was over before it even began. Thaddius tried to scramble backward, crawling desperately toward the kitchen doors, but Sir William planted a heavy, steel-plated boot squarely in the middle of Thaddius's back, pinning him to the floor. My king. Sir William called out, tossing a thick, leather-bound ledger onto the ruined banquet table. The armory guard surrendered it willingly. The girl speaks the truth. There are detailed manifests here. Orders to transport blight-infected materials to the Riverlands. Cedric turned his back on the pathetic, groveling Alpha and walked back to Genevieve. She was trembling violently, the adrenaline fading, leaving only the crushing agony of her wounds and the lingering poison in her veins. She began to collapse, but Cedric caught her effortlessly, cradling her broken body against his chest. I have you, he murmured into her dark hair, his voice entirely stripped of the monster that had just killed a man. You are safe. I swear it on my life, you are safe. The villagers, she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut. William Torfhetul. Cedric commanded, without looking away from her. Send 2 detachments to the human valleys. Secure them under the banner of the Northern Howl. Any Oakhaven soldier who tries to harm a human is to be executed on the spot. And what of Thaddius and his daughter, sire? William asked, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Cedric looked over his shoulder. Thaddius and Beatrix were kneeling together, weeping and begging for mercy. Strip them of their titles. Seize their assets. Cedric ordered, his voice cold and indifferent. Bind them in iron and send them to the deep frost mines in the northern mountains. Let them spend the rest of their miserable lives digging ore in the dark. If they survive the winter, they will have earned their crust of bread." "No!" Beatrix sobbed, clawing at the stone floor as the northern knights dragged her away. "I am a lady. You cannot do this." Her screams faded into the corridors, a fitting end to the cruelty of Oakhaven. Cedric carried Genevieve out of the manor, refusing to let his medics touch her, until they were inside his own heavily guarded carriage. For the first time in 5 years, Genevieve felt the warmth of a real fire and rested on a bed of velvet rather than rotting straw. The northern healers worked frantically. They administered a powerful herbal purge to flush the liquid wolfsbane from her system, followed by soothing salves of crushed moonflower to ease the pain of her lacerated back. As the poison finally drained from her blood, a miracle occurred. The heavy, suffocating block on her inner wolf vanished. A brilliant, ethereal white light began to radiate from Genevieve's skin. The deep, jagged wounds on her back, the ones that had been continuously ripped open for years, began to knit together at an astonishing speed. The silver scar tissue melted away, leaving behind flawless, smooth skin. Her matted, dull hair turned glossy, and the hollows of her cheeks filled with color. When Genevieve finally opened her eyes 3 days later, she was no longer in Oakhaven. She was lying in a massive, fur-lined bed in the royal chambers of the northern keep, overlooking snow-capped mountains and pristine pine forests. Cedric was sitting in a chair beside the bed, looking as though he hadn't slept in days. When he saw her eyes open, he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since they met. "You're awake," he said softly, leaning forward. Genevieve sat up, realizing for the first time that the agonizing, constant pain in her back was completely gone. She touched her shoulder, finding smooth skin. She looked at Cedric, the fierce, terrifying king who had burned a corrupt empire to the ground just to keep her safe. "Your sister," Genevieve said urgently, throwing off the furs. "Princess Rosalind. Where is she?" Cedric looked surprised. "She is in the healer's wing, but you need to rest. Take me to her." Genevieve insisted, standing up. For the first time, she didn't stumble. She felt powerful. She felt whole. In the medical wing, young Princess Rosalind lay pale and gasping, the dark veins of the silver blight creeping up her neck. Cedric stood by the door, watching nervously as Genevieve approached the bed. Genevieve didn't need a whip. She didn't need to be tortured. Taking a small silver dagger from the bedside table, she made a tiny shallow cut on the palm of her hand. Her blood didn't just glow faintly anymore. Without the wolfsbane suppressing her, it shimmered like pure liquid starlight. She pressed her bleeding palm to Rosalind's trembling lips. "Drink, little one," she whispered. The effect was instantaneous. As the pure, unstressed white lycan blood entered Rosalind's system, the dark, blighted veins began to recede. Color rushed back into the princess's cheeks, and her shallow, rattling breaths smoothed out into a deep, peaceful sleep. Cedric fell to his knees beside the bed, tears welling in the eyes of the ruthless winter butcher. He took Genevieve's uninjured hand and pressed his forehead against her knuckles. "You have given me my world," Cedric whispered. "Ask for anything, my queen. Name your price, and it is yours." Genevieve looked down at the man who had shattered her chains, feeling the ancient, beautiful thrum of their mate bond settling perfectly into place. "I don't want a price, Cedric." She smiled, her white wolf purring softly in the back of her mind. "I just want to go home. With you." And she did. Genevieve Hayes, the broken Omega of Oakhaven, was crowned the White Queen of the North. Under her gentle guidance and Cedric's fierce protection, they freely distributed the cure to the silver blight, saving thousands of lives across the continent. Oakhaven became a forgotten ruin, swallowed by the forest, serving only as a grim reminder of the past. Genevieve never hid her scars. Though her body had healed them, she wore her history as a badge of survival, ruling beside her king, not as a secret to be exploited, but as the most powerful force their world had ever seen. And that is exactly why you never underestimate the quiet strength of an Omega, especially when she carries the blood of the white lycans. Genevieve's horrific past transformed her into the most revered queen in werewolf history, and Thaddius certainly got the brutal karma he deserved in those frozen mines. If you loved this tale of ultimate revenge, fated mates and dark secrets, make sure to smash that like button. Share this story with anyone who loves a fiercely satisfying romantic drama, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next epic pack legend. Let us know in the comments what you would have done to Thaddius.